Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I am your host and beat reporter, and I've been your beat reporter covering the Jacksonville Jaguars for On SI every single day since August 2019, and we are continuing to march forward through another offseason together. As always, you can always find our 100% free, 24/7 boots on the ground coverage of the Jacksonville Jaguars when you follow us on social media such as Facebook and Twitter at Jaguars on SI. You can also find us at www.si.com/NFL/Jaguars. All right, folks, welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. Of course, my name is John Shipley. I am your host and beat reporter. Today, what we're going to talk about is a question that I think is worthy of asking every year around the time of training camp. Who will be this year's training camp star? It happens every single year. A guy who just stands out in training camp throughout the entire course of really the month and a half long process. Last year it was Parker Washington. The year before, Calvin Ridley. Seems to be a lot of wide receivers, but it's certainly, in my opinion, a question worth asking every single training camp. Who are some guys who have a chance to be the most talked about players over the course of the Jaguars training camp? To me, the hit rate on having a great training camp and then going on and doing something within the regular season, it can be up and down. I remember, who was it? There was a tight end that the Kansas City Chiefs signed after the Jaguars kind of surprisingly cut him. I'm trying to remember exactly who he was. The name is escaping me at the moment. Garrett Prince. That's who it was. Garrett Prince in the 2023 training camp was catching freaking everything. He was a terror. And he still didn't make the 53-man roster, largely because of, the numbers game at a position. Wasn't really a blocker. They had already drafted Brendan Strange to kind of be their young tight end of the future. And that's actually a perfect segue into the first guy I want to talk about. I think there's a real chance that Brendan Strange can be the winner of the Jaguars training camp. He had a really strong offseason program, I thought, showed good hands, was moved all around the formation by Liam Cohen and his staff, and you can just tell him and Trevor Lawrence have a good amount of chemistry. You can tell that whether it was built in practice reps last year, whether it was in the games that Evan Ingram missed, whatever it was, that these two players built a solid connection. And to me, I thought outside of his connection with Brian Thomas, that his connection with Brendan Strange was as automatic as any during the offseason program. These are two guys who they spent a decent amount of time together. It's now their third training camp entering together. Obviously Evan Ingram got the bulk of the reps the first two training camps. But now, as we're moving forward into the post-Evan Ingram era, it's clear that Brendan Strange is the number one tight end. It's clear that Brendan Strange is going to play a big role in the offense, even if he's not catching 50, 60, 70 passes. Brendan Strange is going to play a big role. Brendan Strange is going to play a big role as a blocker. He's going to play a big role, in my opinion, as a receiver. Now, am I saying I think he's going to get 10 targets a game? I'm not, because in the hierarchy of their skill group, I still think he clearly comes behind the first three wide receivers. So I think he's probably the number 4 option in the passing game once week 1 in the regular season roll around. But Strange is somebody who, especially when pads come on, I'm just expecting big things out of. I'm expecting him to have a big training camp. I'm expecting him to be impressive in practice, and I'm expecting it to carry over into week 1. Now, outside of that, another guy who I think can be one of the real stars of training camp, I'm going to go Jordan Lewis. To me, Jordan Lewis is exactly what the Jaguars needed in the secondary. He's a leader. He's experienced. He's smart. He has good technique. But most importantly, he's fiery and he's passionate. You can tell just by watching him practice. I'm not talking about, any quotes he gives or anything like that. I'm just talking about the guy I see practice for the Jaguars. He brings the intensity and competition up to another level. And he's a really impressive, guy to watch challenge the Jaguars receivers. Like, he was challenging Travis Hunter. He was challenging De'Ami Brown. He was challenging Brian Thomas. And I think as we go through the course of the offseason, mix in his really outgoing personality with some of the plays that he makes, I think he's going to be somebody we're talking about consistently through the course of training camp. I think he's somebody who's going to be in line to make a lot of plays. I think he's somebody who is obviously going to play a major role, whether that's the starting nickel guy, whether that's starting across from Tyson Campbell in 2 cornerback looks, whatever it looks like. I think Jordan Lewis is set to have his name written about and talked about quite a bit over the course of training camp. To me, him and Tyson Campbell each are guys that you can probably consider to include in here. Tyson Campbell, another guy, had a really strong offseason program, but these are guys that just proved, in my opinion, during the offseason program, that they're going to take things up a notch in practice, especially Lewis. Had some really impressive reps, especially in the red zone, and he lets people know about it too. So I think he's going to have a strong offseason program. Not offseason program, training camp. Another guy who I think by the end of training camp, he's probably going to hear his name talked about a little bit more. I'm going to go with left tackle Walker Little. The reviews on Little after the offseason program have been very positive. I know he wasn't their guy that they brought in. They didn't pay him. That was Trent Baalke paid him, etc., even though he had never been officially, a guy who had won a job in training camp or anything like that. But I think now that he's not getting the okie doke during training camp, that they're not saying, it's a competition for left tackle when it's not at all a competition with, in my opinion, a worse left tackle in front of him. I think Walker Little is going to thrive and shine during training camp. I think by the end of training camp, he will have been so impressive that it will be a question of why didn't this guy get slotted in as the franchise left tackle sooner? I don't think he's being pushed or will be pushed by Fred Johnson. I think Walker Little is very clearly the best tackle on the Jaguars roster. And I think over the course of training camp, as we see him go through one-on-ones and as we see him battle with the likes of Josh Hines-Allen, Trayvon Walker, Emmanuel Ogbah, DeJuan Smoot, etc., I think that he's somebody who is simply going to end up being one of the more impressive performers for the Jaguars during training camp. And then lastly, I'm going to go with Eric Armstead. I think everything is in place for Eric Armstead to have a resurgent season. Looking at his numbers last year, and we've talked about this before, as you guys all know from listening, that there is no real reason for Brandon Strange to have been playing defensive end last year. It doesn't seem like anybody can come to a consensus on why he played it so much, who was really at fault, etc., but it just shouldn't have happened. And you look at his pressure splits when he played defensive tackle compared to when he played defensive end, it makes you wonder what was really going on. It makes you wonder how an NFL coaching staff could think that is what was best for the team week in and week out. And I get it. They didn't have defensive end depth. But that's something you do in the offseason. The media had been screaming at Trent Baalke for several off seasons that he didn't have defensive end depth, and he more or less laughed it off. So I think now that you see Armstead in his more natural position at 3 technique, I think you'll see and hear a lot more from him over the course of training camp. Didn't practice much in training camp last year due to an injury. Has been, at least to my knowledge, 100% participant through the offseason program, etc., fully healthy, whatever you want to call it. I think now that he'll be practicing a 3 technique and not as a 300-pound or near 300-pound defensive end, that you will see more impact plays from him over the course of training camp. I think that him moving inside is going to do wonders for him, and to me, it should help him at least put forth some of the production that so many people expected him to have last year. That is all for today, so thank you guys for listening. Please like, follow, subscribe, whatever you have to do at the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all other podcast platforms.